All right, and welcome if you're just joining and people are introducing themselves in the chat. And we are just working on getting started. All right, thank you, Martessa. So we are here to provide a research progress update with everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Evan Schmidt, CEO of Valley Vision. I'm going to just talk for a couple minutes to set the stage for us, and then I'm going to turn it over to our research partners to go through some of the data and the information that they have to share with us. So if we could go to the next slide. And I think if you're here, you're probably somewhat familiar with the program, with the California Jobs First, in parentheses, CERF program. But I do want to just get us all on the same page and start with that. So the California Jobs First program is anchored in creating inclusive economic development in regions across California. And that includes advancing both pathways to and the creation of high quality jobs. And that's really the central goal of the program itself. Both the process and the outcomes need to be equity centered. And this is doing economic development in this way is a new approach for the state. And so they're really advancing this kind of novel approach to inclusive economic development across the state. We also are anchored to low carbon transition. So really looking at how are we moving our economy to a lower carbon to meet California's ambitious climate goals. And then finally, for our region and regions across the state, we want to catalyze investments, both through the California Jobs First program, but through other sources as well, including federal infrastructure funds, private funds, philanthropy, and in all other ways. So this is a statewide program, but we are representing the capital region here, and that's an 8-county region. And Valley Vision team is here as your regional convener. We can go to the next slide, please. All right, so I think that, one thing we really want to emphasize is that this is a historic amount of investment for our regions, and it's a really good thing because it's a really pivotal moment in terms of both challenges and opportunities for our region. So we know coming out of the pandemic that we're seeing increasing economic disparities across all types of demographics. And in addition to, pandemic recovery, we also are seeing an increasing in negative impacts due to the climate crisis and a number of challenges that are hitting our communities. And so part of the way that the California Jobs First program is designed is to address both the economic disparities and the increasing climate crisis that we're living through. Next slide, please. So as part of the California Jobs First program, the solution set is, first of all, to create a shared regional vision. The region is the appropriate and a great scale for us to be thinking about how do we drive our local economies, but do it in a way that's scalable and that can support high growth industries. Part of the solution is centering the voices of those who are experiencing the disparities. So really making sure that this is a program that is focused on inclusive processes and equitable outcomes, and then creating high quality jobs and sustainable industries. And when we turn it over to Cities GPS, our research partners, they're going to talk more about what that means across the board. Next slide, please. And then finally, the opportunity that we're faced. So really thinking this is historic investments. We're at a really pivotal time with a lot of crises kind of coming to a head. So the idea is we really can drive change here. We have the opportunity to create changes and to change the way economic development is done and help support equitable growth across our region. So through collaboration, we can build that stronger regional framework, and we can bring state, federal, and other investments back home and into our region. So this is a great opportunity for us to really take action together. Next slide, please. And so taking action together, we will. So some of the specific goals for our region, first of all, is to create a collaborative. You all are a part of that collaborative, but creating that regional vision that everybody can see themselves in and that everybody's a part of designing is a really important part of this program. producing a regional roadmap for economic development. This is kind of the ultimate outcome of our planning phase. And so the planning phase for the California Jobs First program is what we're right in the middle of right now. And by summer next year, so 2024, the idea is that we will have produced a really comprehensive roadmap for our region that includes identifying those sustainable high growth sectors, identifying inclusive pathways, and really creating a project pipeline and a set of priorities that can create inclusive economic growth. Attracting investments into our region. I've already spoke to this, but a super important part of the program is making sure that we're putting our best foot forward as a region. We're really developing our priorities, developing a shared vision, and then telling that story in a way that enables us to bring investments into the region, and then ultimately enabling the creation of accessible, high-quality jobs. Next slide, please. So what have we already done as part of the planning phase? We've secured the $5 million planning grant, and that's what we're working on right now. We've established a collaborative of over 130 organizations, and thank you to all of you for being a part of that. We've been doing a lot of work around bringing in community partners. So we have funded 18 other organizations with about $2.2 million to conduct this work as part of this regional platform that we're all a part of. And we've begun intensive research efforts to inform our decision-making. And I think that's where my part of the presentation ends, because we want to provide you all an update and a look into the research that we've been creating. And so, first of all, I'm grateful for the Valley Vision team itself, who is here on the call, and that includes Martessa Bravo Ares, Renee John, Darlene Meza, and Alana Ramsey, who've been supporting this work so far. And then also our research partners, Cities GPS, which is a Brookings Institution affiliated group, and Chad Shearer and Rachel Barker are here with us today. And the role of research is a really important part of this overall program. First of all, and I think you're going to see this when I turn it over to Chad here in a minute, but the economic research that they're working on is what really helps us understand what our region's opportunity landscape is. So if we're going to be successful, we have to understand, where do we have areas of potential? Where do we have areas of challenge? And a lot of that is in our kind of more macroeconomic sphere. And so by having a mechanism to dive into that economic data and that research, it really helps us understand, where are those opportunities, where are the challenges, and where do we have the potential to take action that could change these patterns. So that's a really important part of the program overall. And, you know, as we're working with the research team to do this, to do the research, it's really important that it's actionable. This is here to help us inform decision making. So it's one of the inputs. It's not the only input. There's going to be a lot of community engagement that goes on across our more localized sub-regional tables. There'll be a lot of strategy development, but having this data as a place to start to understand what those, like I said, what the opportunities and challenges might be and what that landscape looks like is a really important part of how we can do effective decision making and really maximize our ability to help make impact, right? Those equitable outcomes around job creation is our goal, and it takes a number of different types of inputs to make that happen, and data is a really important part of that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chad to share a progress update on our research so far.
Thanks for that intro, Evan. Hi, everybody. My name is Chad Shearer. I am the lead researcher, quantitative researcher for Cities GPS. As Evan said, we are a Brookings-affiliated research team based in Washington, D.C. and Chicago, Illinois. It's not just me. We are led by Merritt Gutman, who's a senior non-resident fellow at Brookings, who may be joining us here shortly to listen in and to offer some thoughts as we go through the research that we've provided to date. I'm also joined here by another member of our team, Rachel Barker, and I'm going to let Rachel introduce herself real quick.
Hi, everyone. I am Rachel Barker. I focused on qualitative research and project management on our team. Really great to see you all today.
So we are providing a lot of the research for as Evan said, the kind of background or the kind of underpinning for the strategies that come out of Jobs First. And that includes the quantitative research, a lot of which you'll see today, as well as qualitative research on existing strategies in each of the counties and subregions across this 8-county region, and interviews with leaders and organizations throughout the region, including companies, workforce investment boards, economic development organizations, to understand the ins and outs of these organizations, their strategies, and kind of how all of this adds up across the regions, kind of what's already in motion, and how all of this tremendous ecosystem all fits together. What I want to go through today is really the quantitative side of that research. So the kind of data that we're building out, as Evan said, to support decision making. We are, I'd say, probably 80% through that process at this point, of building out that fact base. And we're going to be showing you probably 80% of that 80% today, which is just about everything that we have time for. So we'll be going over a lot, and there's even more to come as we work towards delivering a kind of first draft of a report in the first half of December. So what we really are excited to do today is preview some of that work for you, but a few caveats about it first before I begin. This is still draft, which is why we haven't shared any of the research with you yet. We're kind of in the stages of finalizing what's here and interpreting what's going on. And that means that we are also not at the stage of kind of having a kind of narrative or coherent story about the region yet. So what you're going to see today are a lot of analyses that kind of paint little vignettes of what we can understand about the region as a whole and each of the subregions. So if you're looking for something that's kind of overarching, sorry, just be patient with us, we're almost there. So this may feel a bit like death by 1,000 cuts as we go through each of a million data points. But I promise we're getting there. So like I said, those findings will be coming in the first half of December, and we will be looking forward to engaging with you all collectively or individually to review that and make sure that this is well grounded in your understanding of what these trends mean as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start jumping through this, and so let me pull up those slides. And before I begin, I'll just note that we have several sections that we're going to be going through. I'm going to get to our table of contents. So we're going to be talking about the region's economic performance, opportunity, and talent today. We can talk a little bit about innovation if we have time. Within each of these sections, there are kind of breaks where I can kind of pause and make sure that we're all understanding the data the same way, and to kind of cover any questions. I'm sure there will be things that I miss or forget to mention. And so I'll kind of build in those points where I can kind of pause and take questions. We're a big group, so if you have questions as I'm going through this, maybe just put them in the chat and we can come back to them at those little moments where we can kind of check in. Sound good? Seeing a few heads nod and thumbs up. Great. And Rachel will help me keep track of any questions as they come up, because I will have a hard time seeing them as I'm presenting. Okay, so we are providing research in a number of areas. So first, this data book covers a kind of economic overview, which is really a focus on how all of these 8 counties kind of fit together collectively and fit together into a series of 5 subregions. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Then we want to talk about how these 8 county economies have been performing collectively as a region, as a regional economy, in terms of economic growth and economic prosperity over the prior 10-year period from about 2013 through 2022. And we'll be looking at that in comparison to both the United States and the state of California to understand how the region has been performing. Then we're going to pivot and we're going to start talking about economic opportunity in the region. So we're talking about kind of how all of this economic growth and prosperity has been translating into opportunities for individuals and families. And the goal there is to, on one hand, first identify who isn't really being helped by all this economic growth and prosperity. How many people are we really talking about? What are the profiles of those workers who are struggling to support their families? And then really, what are the jobs that would help those workers really enter the middle class, be able to support all of their families' needs? And where are those jobs in the economy? How can we grow more of them? We do have a really big section on innovation, which is just really long, so we may not go into that today. But I do have a few slides on talent, especially around the kinds of talent that we find in these good jobs that support struggling workers, and how we can get struggling workers trained up for the good jobs that are already in this region's economy. So that's kind of how we're organizing all of the analysis that we're providing. There's also some other analysis that I described before, qualitative research and interviews, that some of which falls under these headings, and other parts of it that don't. And then we're also providing research around public health, the environment, and a few other topics that are required by the state, which I won't have time to mention today. The way we kind of think about these 6 headings that are on here is that on one hand, we're just trying to understand what's been going on, understand your economy. So that's what the overview and performance section is really about. The opportunity section is really about understanding the kind of challenge and opportunity that the region has around economic inclusion and equity. And then clusters, innovation, and talent are ultimately about the building blocks or the kind of levers that we have to build out a more inclusive, equitable, and low carbon economy. And so that's kind of how we've split this up, is thinking about kind of describing what we've got and the challenges that we face, and then thinking about the assets that we have to build on. I hope that's helpful. So let's just start with the overview here. This is a quick short section, and so we'll get through this, and then I'll take a quick series of questions before we move on to economic performance. So the first thing that we wanted to kind of start, with last summer is just what do each of these counties look like? We're talking about an 8-county region, which is the entire Sacramento metropolitan statistical area, the Yuba and Sutter County area, which forms its own metropolitan statistical area. And then appended to that are Nevada and Colusa counties. The first thing that we see are, of course, that these counties have vastly different scales in terms of population and jobs. As we go down the list, you can see that they, as we go up, each county is about an order of magnitude larger than the one beneath it in some cases. So as we go from Colusa to Yuba, we're talking about a 4-fold increase. As we go from Nevada to El Dorado, we're talking about a 2-fold increase. And as we go from Yolo to Placer, another 2-fold increase. And then a 4-fold increase as we go from Placer to Sacramento. So very, very different sizes of these county economies. And the counties also have very different levels of prosperity, kind of. So when we think about how much the average worker earns, we can see that, we go from a low of $64,000 per year in Sutter County to a high of $93,000 per year in Sacramento. And we also see differences in the productivity of the average worker, which tells us something about how capital intensive each of these county economies are. So Sutter County is a little bit less productive and probably more capital intensive compared to Placer County. And what these differences tell us is that, it's important to keep in mind that there's a lot of variation across the region as we begin to think about kind of regional strategies that could support their growth. Another thing that we see is that not all of these regions counties are really all that economically similar to one another, although in some cases they are. So I'm not going to go into kind of all of the math that's behind this summary assessment, but these are kind of indications of how industrial or occupationally similar the counties are to each other. We're looking here only at counties that are adjacent to each other. That means they share a border. And the measure here is on a 100-point scale. So from 0 to 100. with 100 meaning that they are perfectly similar to one another in terms of their industry or occupational structure. What we can see here is that, Sutter, Yuba, not actually that similar to each other in industrially or occupationally, despite being part of the same metropolitan statistical area. Whereas in where when we look at Nevada or Placer, we can see that actually these are quite similar to each other in both industrially and occupationally. Sacramento and Yolo, also, despite being right next door to each other and being a core part of the Sacramento metropolitan area, they also are not really all that similar to each other industrially, although they are a bit more similar to each other occupationally. So again, this just drives home that not only do we see different levels of, different scales and levels of prosperity across the region, but we also are in some cases talking about quite different, economies, when we think about the kind of industries that drive each of these counties. And then we wanted to understand how the counties kind of cluster together naturally based on the movement of workers. So to what extent do they share the same labor market? And I know the arrows and the labels here are a little bit confusing. What we're showing here is the size of the county dot here represents the number of jobs. So you can see Sacramento is really quite large compared to Colusa County, which is tiny. And then the arrows represent the share of the destination county's workers that come from the donor counties. So we can see here that 28% of Placer County workers come from Sacramento. That is 28% of Placer County's workers live in Sacramento County. 29% of Yolo County's workers live in Sacramento County. And then what we did is we did some machine learning analysis on this network to understand kind of how these counties naturally fit into subregions. And what the machine learning process shows us is that Sacramento and Yolo County, they definitely form their own kind of subregion here. Sutter County and Yuba County form their own subregion. Placer and El Dorado form their own subregion, and then Placer, El Dorado, and Nevada also form a subregion. But for our purposes, we are going to set apart Nevada County and Colusa County as their own subregions in this. So all of this work that I've just been showing you is really to understand how we should be kind of breaking up the region, breaking up these 8 counties into subregions to kind of understand the kind of building blocks of how they vary and fit together. So throughout this presentation and this data book, you will see us refer to subregions as Sacramento, Yolo, El Dorado, Placer, Sutter, Yuba, and then Colusa and Nevada by themselves. And I think that and then, yes, okay, so once we get to these kind of subregion groupings, we see the same kind of different scales of these economies, although it begins to even out, as do the kind of the average earnings and productivity. So grouping the counties together this way, we still see quite a bit of variation across the region, but it kind of lessens the amount of variation that we do see when we look at it by subregions instead of by counties. So before we start jumping into our analysis of the region and each of these subregions, I'll just pause in case there are any clarifying questions on this so far. And please just feel free to speak up and if you've got a question, or write it in the chat.
So Chad, I'll jump in. This is Dave Spar. Looking at Colusa group. What I noticed from those patterns is starting back in the 80s, sorry, I'm a little bit older, Valley Vision worked very closely with Sacramento County, El Dorado County, and Placer County, and Yolo to some extent. But those 4 counties were really dependent on working with one another to create a job base. And we targeted the type of companies, we targeted the types of jobs we wanted. And Valley Vision brought together the educational partners, and we trained the workforce. and the workforces started commuting and interacting. And we wanted Placer County to be a job center, and I worked and lived in Placer County at that time. I could see now that interrelationship or that dependence, if we could expand that out to Nevada, Yuba, Sutter, and Colusa, it could aid them as well. And I know that's one of the goals here, but they feel like they've been left out of the overall region, and they're not part of the Sacramento region of the 4 counties. They interacted in the last 20 years. So maybe in the next 20 years, they can be more inclusive, be included, and we can do more of that job sharing to build a stronger economy. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Evan.
Oh, I was going to say, no, thank you for that, David. And I agree. This is an opportunity for us to kind of look at what we think of typically as our region and maybe expand some connectivity there. I also think the way that this program kind of centralizes some aspects of coordination across regions, there could be opportunities too to lean into different parts of our more mega Northern California region in unique ways. So I do think this creates a lot of opportunity around regional identification and scale, and potentially the hope of optimizing local economies by looking at that regional context. So I appreciate that.
I have one question for you, Chad. Thanks so much for this presentation so far. Was there anything that you saw of note around age stratification in the labor market, specifically just thinking about aging populations, and if there was anything that you may have seen that jumped out at you across these subregions?
We did not use demographic similarities to understand any kind of possible complementarities between the counties. So that's a really interesting question, but one that I can't speak to.
You're doing a lot. Thanks.
We are. Right. So, Eric, yeah, you bring up a great point in the chat about the kind of, I mean, this is a really big distended region with mountains and valleys that separate a lot of people from one another. One thing that, we've noted is, or that other people have noted on some of the early calls where we started sharing this out, is that, part of Placer County's job base is actually right next to Sacramento. It's really part of the kind of outgrowth suburbanization of the Sacramento County job base. Same thing to a lesser extent with El Dorado County. And so, and yet there's other kind of job centers or urban centers further east in both of those counties that are really not that well connected to the center of Sacramento. And same thing with Tahoe and Truckee, very, very far away. So that was one of the reasons that we ended up splitting this up the way we did. And I'll mention that this wasn't just Brookings or Cities GPS making these decisions by ourselves. We also got input on the kind of institutional affiliations and partnerships among these counties and those kinds of institutional dynamics. But that was a core reason why we decided to do sub-regional analysis this way, was to understand that, or to embrace the idea that, while the hope is that we can, kind of spur more regional collaboration and economic cooperation, that we also have to, continue to understand and embrace the fact that this is a very large region with a lot of urban centers that are, in some cases, physically far away from big job centers, and that those deserve growth and equity as well. And so we need to kind of be doing this analysis for Nevada and Colusa kind of independently to understand what their strengths and opportunities look like as well.
Chad, there's a question in the chat about the source of the data used for this analysis of commuting patterns.
Yeah. So this is an analysis of data from Lightcast, which is a data provider of economic information at the local level. Lightcast is taking the data from the longitudinal employer household dynamics survey from, LEHD, from the Census Bureau, and specifically the loads data, which is origin and destination data for workers. But they are projecting it forward. So I think the latest loads data is for probably 2021, and Lightcast here is projecting it forward to 2022. And that's where we get these numbers. So in the interest of time, I'll just continue to move forward, but happy to come back to this if there are more questions as we start to go through the economic performance section. So first, we're going to talk about overall change in the region, the kind of size and prosperity of the region. So from 2012 as our kind of start year through 2022 as our end year, this region's job base grew by almost 20%. So really, really healthy growth. You can see that the recession did take a toll during the pandemic. Jobs shrank. The job base did shrink, but it's come roaring back. And so it looks like from extrapolating outwards, the region entered or exited the recession rather in about early 2022 or mid 2021. Not only did jobs grow, but earnings grew, and earnings growth has remained high. And that's actually something that's quite different from other regions throughout the country and even in California. Often, what happens during recessions is we see a huge spike in earnings as people get laid off, a spike in average earnings as people get laid off. We also saw a really big gain in value added, or the gross regional product as a whole, over this period of time, growing by more than a third. So really, really healthy growth, looks really great. And then we've got these prosperities rankings. So like I was saying, this is what I was referring to before. As the economy begins to shrink, often less productive industries and lower paid workers get laid off first. And so averages shoot up. And then as the economy begins to recover and demand for those less productive industries returns, this will return to earth. So I wouldn't get too excited about this run up or too depressed by the kind of fall in 2022. This is pretty normal part of an economic cycle. What we're excited about overall is the kind of the reasonably healthy inflation adjusted average earning growth over this period of time. And then we see a similar kind of change in productivity. It shot up and now it's leveled off. Hopefully this doesn't fall, but it may, and that wouldn't be really too much of a reason for concern. Of course, what we're really interested in is the pattern of job growth, or the pattern of growth overall in this region. Which industries are really driving economic growth and which ones are kind of lagging. And what we're showing here is that when we look at when we break up industries by the types of consumers or customers that they serve, we see really different patterns of growth. So tradable industries are industries that primarily sell products and services to customers outside of the region, so beyond the kind of 8-county area. Things like zero emission vehicles or professional services that are traded, or precision instruments or microchips. Those are all kinds of products or services that may be for a global market or at least an international market. And tradable industries are important because not only are they higher paying, but they also kind of fuel growth in other sectors. So what we saw over this period of time was that actually tradable industry growth was pretty modest. And what really drove the kind of dramatic job gains that we saw throughout the economy were local serving industries like healthcare, retail, food service, that really cater to local consumers and households. And that's not necessarily bad. We do like to see job growth and people having jobs, but it can begin to raise concern over time if it means that local serving industries are kind of being crowded out, or if there are factors that are holding back tradable industry growth, which is something that we'll talk a lot about in a moment. And this trend, this pattern of local serving industry-led growth is something that we see across these big indicators. So in earnings, we can see that local serving sectors really grabbed a lot of the growth there too. also in value added, although tradable industries do look slightly better there. And then in average earnings, tradable industries actually contributed nothing because the growth in local serving sectors actually crowded out or kind of undermined the contributions of tradable industries to increases in average earnings and productivity. Like I said before, tradable industries are slightly higher paying than local serving industries because these are industries that compete for workers, compete for the most skilled workers, and so they'll pay a premium. But when that growth gets kind of drowned out by local serving sectors, it's hard for that kind of prosperity that tradable industries create for the region to shine through. So overall, really great growth story, but very highly dependent on those local serving industries. And this is a pattern that we saw really throughout the region. So for each of the subregions, we saw a similar pattern over the course of this 10-year period from 2012 to 2022. The one exception was Calusa, where we saw a lot of tradable industry-led growth throughout the time series until we got to the economic recovery of 2022, when all that tradable industry growth basically disappeared and was replaced by local serving industries. And this is really a story about the kind of role that resource-intensive commodity industries play in Calusa County's economy. But across the other regions, you can see very, very heavily driven by local serving industries as well. And notable here also is the role of the public sector, which, despite its size especially in Sacramento County, didn't really kind of shine through as a really huge part of the job growth story. It was actually played a bigger role in some of the other other subregions. What we're really interested in understanding is how the region's economy has been performing against these benchmarks. So we saw that, the region's...
Yeah, there's a question in the chat, I think, related to your last slide.
Yeah, so small businesses can be in tradable industries. So the industry classification is really about the function of the firm, not the size of the firm. So, Sutter Health, for example, giant healthcare firm, is classified as a local serving industry, or at least its healthcare jobs are. So anything that has to do with kind of clinical medicine, that's healthcare, that's local serving. Whereas corporate headquarters for Sutter Health, Sutter Health operates a multi-county or statewide health system. So those corporate jobs are classified in a different part of the economy, and they're classified as tradable. Same thing with a little machine shop, a mom and pop or garage kind of machine shop that creates parts for automobiles. Technically, they're part of the supply chain for an automobile industry. So they could be selling parts to, a zero emission vehicle factory in the county or in the region, or they could be selling parts, to Detroit. In either case, because they're part of that tradable industry supply chain, they're counted as a tradable industry. So size doesn't really matter as much as what the business is doing and who it's selling to. So what we really are wanting to understand is how the region's economy has been performing relative to these benchmarks. And so what we've done here is we've created an apples to apples comparison of the region's economy to the US economy and the California economy. Basically, what we're doing is we're saying, let's pretend that the US and California had exactly the same industry structure as the capital region. What would have happened? How would those economies have grown? And how does that compare to the capital region's actual performance? And so what we can see is that on a lot of these indicators, the capital region actually did a lot better, or slightly better, at least, than their counterparts in California or the United States. So we can see on job growth, it actually beat those expectations. It beat its benchmarks. On value-added growth, it also beat it. On earnings growth, it beat the US and just slightly trailed California. And then on average earnings and productivity, it basically held its own. In some cases, US or California did slightly better, but on the whole, we could say, okay, it's pretty much a wash. Where we see differences are when we start, again, breaking this down and looking at other parts of the economy. Tradable industries actually lagged growth in the US and California in terms of jobs, earnings, and value added. And they also did worse in terms of average earnings and productivity. So when we compare, benchmarks, this shows that the region isn't doing quite as well, or its tradable industries haven't done quite as well as their counterparts in the rest of the state or the United States. Whereas in local serving industries, we can see that they're doing really, really well. They're actually growing a lot faster than their counterparts in the rest of the state and the country. And their changes in prosperity metrics like average earnings and productivity, they're pretty much on par or doing slightly better in the case of average earnings. So we do see that variation. And then here we've got options where you can kind of jump down and see, all right, how did the region perform in manufacturing? Okay, so in jobs, it did actually a lot better. Value added, not as great. Earnings, not as great. In fact, earnings overall appear to have shrunk. And then average earnings and productivity also not great. And then we can look at a local serving or primarily local serving industry like healthcare here. And see that, on a lot of these measures, it's pretty much par with what's going on in California and considerably better than what's going on throughout the rest of the United States. When we do this for the subregions, what we come away with is a picture of a region that's actually, on the whole, doing well. So we're looking for, what we want to see is lots of green and blue here. So the green means you beat both, the US and California on that measure in that subregion. Blue means you beat the United States but lagged California, and red means you lagged both. And so you can see overall, most of the subregions here are performing better than expected, on the whole, except in the case of productivity where we see some laggards. And then we can also look at this by tradable industries and see that weaker performance that I was talking about a moment ago, it's actually pretty widespread, except in Colusa County and Yuba and Sutter counties, where they look really good on growth and maybe not as great on average earnings. And again, we've got this built in so you can kind of look across and see what this looks like for each of those major sectors of the economy. So here's professional services, which is, lawyers, engineering firms, technical services, consulting, but kind of advanced business consulting, not looking great there. And then we've got transportation and warehousing, so logistics, where things look a little bit better in terms of overall growth, but maybe not as great in terms of prosperity. And again, we've got these same kind of slides built for looking at jobs, earnings, value added, productivity, and average earnings for each of the subregions. So you can kind of take your time and explore this once we're ready to share this out.
And hey, Chad, could I make a comment about tradable sectors? And there's a question here from Annette as well.
Yep.
This idea of, I think over the last 5 years in particular, there's been a strong emphasis on tradable clusters in our region because this is really our opportunity to grow jobs and diversify the economy in a place that has, especially the kind of Sacramento centric part of our region, really has been dependent on government, which provides a lot of high quality jobs, but we don't have as much control over in terms of trying to create jobs because it's not anchored to a global market. And so, what Chad is showing here is that our tradable clusters have lagged what has long been a really strong locally serving market in terms of jobs. But we have over the last 5 years seen some growth with our tradable sectors and seeing, there's been in that emphasis to really diversify our economy. I think there's been good work that has been done, and there continues to be potential to develop those tradable sectors, and that's going to be an emphasis of this program. So I don't want us to look at this and feel discouraged. I think that we have seen modest improvements across our tradable sectors, and there continues to be opportunity and momentum that has been built to keep building on that. And Chad, if there's anything inaccurate that I just said, please note it. But I wanted to make sure everyone kind of gets that lens that we are working on developing tradable sectors, and we have seen progress in that.
Yes, very, very important point about the kind of agency that we've seen emerging from the region and the traction that it's getting on tradable sectors. One thing that we have been learning through the qualitative work that we've been doing is that there's this important question that we should ask as we're reviewing these kinds of data, which is but for. We always want to ask, well, if we hadn't done XYZ intervention, if, Valley Vision or GSEC or one of the other economic development organizations in the region hadn't been more proactive in courting a new company or retaining another company, what would have happened to these metrics? So this isn't really meant to be an indictment of the region's, the kind of institutional performance of the region. It's really meant to show kind of what kinds of headwinds the region is coping with in its tradable industries. And to highlight areas of intervention that may be able to kind of generate more traction going forward. And further to Evan's point, this is only through 2022. So there are more recent job gains that aren't reflected here and other kinds of job announcements that aren't going to be factored in for a couple more years.
Before we move on, Chad, there's a couple other questions about traded sectors in the chat. One is asking if there's cases where small traded businesses get missed because they're small.
I think I asked that, or I answered that one earlier.
Okay.
That small companies don't get missed. No. Annette, sorry, I missed your question. What role does being a quasi-government town play in the region being more local serving versus tradable? So I think Evan was kind of speaking to that a moment ago, that it is a region that is more dependent on government jobs. And that may contribute to it being more locally serving. The pattern that we're seeing here is what I think is really more noteworthy than the portion of the region that may be more local serving on average anyway. So what we're really calling attention to is the dependence on local serving industries as a growth engine, which over the long term becomes less and less sustainable. Except in the case of kind of tourism or retirees, it's really hard to build on kind of local serving industries as a job generator over the long term. So just calling that out, not on the overall structure of the economy, and of course its relative reliance on public administration.
Great, thank you.
And I think there's one more question about the arts.
Yeah, I did just have the arts up to show what it looked like. And it's arts and recreation is really going to be more heavily focused on the recreation part than the arts. So recreation includes gambling, it includes all the fun stuff that's at Lake Tahoe, any of the kinds of tourism operators in the region, ski lifts, that sort of thing. The arts is really small part of this. I'm going to start skipping ahead here, just in the interest of time, so that we can get to the really critical stuff. Not that this isn't important, but we have other findings that we definitely want to be able to share with you. I am going to pause here for a second to show how this analysis that I've been showing you works. It's built on basically kind of trying to decompose the sources of job or other types of economic growth in the region, so that we can kind of figure out which factors are contributing or detracting from the region's growth. What we're showing here is that California has actually been a net contributor to the region's growth overall. What we find is that in terms of California's macroeconomic growth and also its industry dependent growth, California has been a job generator or a growth generator for the region. So despite kind of the headwinds that we may think that the California cost or regulatory environment may create for local economies, it's also just growing a whole lot faster than the rest of the country. And so that is something that's creating a tailwind for this region. In addition to that, as I've noted before, the region actually outperformed California's growth and did better than the state as a whole in terms of job growth and growth on some of these other metrics. So, but just wanted to pause to note that real quick, because that was a kind of interesting and surprising finding for us. Again, local serving industries, they're really the engine here, accounting for 81% of the region's job growth over this period of time. Tradable sectors accounted for just 12.2%. Typically, what we hope to see is that tradable industries are anywhere from 25% to 1/3 of a region's economy and account for about that amount of growth at least. And in this case, of course, we're seeing that it's far smaller. Public sector as well, small contributor to job growth here. Okay, and there's more fun stuff here, but we'll have to leave that for later. So before I jump into opportunity, anything else to kind of note or react to, questions about economic performance in the region? Shira, yeah. This brings up a really great question about just where are jobs recorded, in this age of remote work. What we're relying on for most of the data that you see here are administrative data records. So, it's based on where the company that employs that worker is located, not where the worker may be performing the job. So that was, really safe and a good way of doing things, of looking at data. Prior to the pandemic. Of course, that's changed now. But one thing that recent data and analysis, not anything that we've done ourselves, but what other economists have done, has shown that the role of remote work isn't really as prevalent as we think it is. I think as knowledge workers on this call, we think that it's really prevalent, and it is for people like us. About 25% of us are doing remote work. But for most of the economy, of that work is being done in person again. So hopefully these data do kind of give us a sense of how these sub-region economies are performing, regardless of kind of the remote work aspects of it. Right. All right. So sorry, any other questions before we jump into opportunity? Okay. So for opportunity, we're going to start by just talking about what does it take to raise a family in this region? What does it cost by county? And then what we want to do is look at how many people belong to families that aren't quite making it, that don't have all of the income that they need to survive. And then we will look at the workers in those families to understand who they are and what they look like in terms of their kind of skill level, work experience, and other factors. And then what we want to do is talk about quality jobs. So the jobs that will help those striving workers get ahead in the future. So first, this is an expensive place to raise a family. Like a lot of places in California and increasing number of places throughout the country, it is just really expensive to raise kids these days. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump to a different family here. So the way this analysis works is that we look at we've got a data source from the University of Washington, and they provide an analysis of the entire state of California, but it's an analysis at the county level. And so they're looking at the actual kinds of big budget areas that a family needs to fill, and what the sizes of those budgets look like, depending on the characteristics and the size of the family itself. And they do this for literally hundreds of different types of families. So what we're looking at here is one example of a family that's represented in their data. We're looking at a family that has 2 adults and 2 kids of different ages. One of the kids is a preschooler and the other one is a teenager. So what we're looking at with the preschoolers is that they probably need, if both parents are full-time workers, that preschooler needs full-time childcare. And so what we see is that for a family that's 2 full-time workers with 1 preschooler and 1 teenager, they need about $90,000 a year to cover all of their just their basic expenses in El Dorado County versus $68,000 a year in Colusa. And when we look closely at these differences in what it costs to raise this family between these 2 counties, we can see a lot of it is driven by housing, first of all. So that's about $1,000 a month in Colusa County. It would be about $1,500 a month in El Dorado County. And then we see big differences in the cost of childcare as well, where we're looking at $16,000 a year in El Dorado County and $10,000 a year in Colusa County. So this is how kind of sensitive this analysis is to these different costs. And again, these are just the most basic costs in each of these categories. On top of these budgets that our data provider gives us, we add emergency savings, which are taxable, and we also add retirement savings, which are not taxable. And then we have calculated taxes, which reflect state, local, and federal taxes. Why do we add savings? Because our data provider is really trying to just show what they're doing is trying to provide an alternative to the federal poverty line, saying this is a grossly low threshold for a family of this size. Nobody can survive on that. And really all it does is reflect the cost of putting food on the table. What the data provider is saying is actually families have so much more that they have to cover, and what they need and what we're counting here are just the basics. So there's really no room for error in these budgets. There's no eating out. There's no family pet, no dog, no cat food involved in here. It's just the basics, and that means that we need to be setting something aside each month in case of an emergency, in case somebody breaks their arm, the car breaks down, or somebody loses their job for a few months. So we build in some emergency savings, and then we're also building in retirement savings to say people really need to be able to put things away and have that economic security beyond their working years. And that gets us to these budgets. And again, we've got something that's very sensitive to differences in the number of kids and the ages of those kids and what they may need at different stages. So again, here we're looking at a family for 3 with 2 preschoolers who both need full-time care, and 1 school-aged child who would presumably need after-school care. And again, we see that El Dorado and Placer County very expensive, Yolo very expensive, and then we see still actually quite high numbers for Colusa and Yuba County, despite being about just 2/3 of what it would cost to raise that same family in El Dorado County. Any questions about these budgets or reactions so far?
Yeah, Chad, there's a comment about the housing numbers seeming low, which I know is something we've heard in a number of places we've done this analysis. Do you want to talk about how that's derived?
So this is basically a living wage calculator, and there are a lot of living wage calculators out there. This one is from the University of Washington. There's another one from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Think tanks run these calculators like the Economic Policy Institute. And then there's another popular calculator called ALICE, which is a project of the United Way. All of them use the same data source for the housing numbers, and that is the fair market rents from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. HUD does an analysis at the county level every year that looks at reported rents and rent equivalents for householders. And it also looks at the actual market rents, so the market rents that are on the market right now. And what they do is they line all of those housing numbers up in a row, and they take the 40th percentile, so not the median, but the 40th percentile, and say, okay, that's the fair market rent. What our data provider does is they take the fair market rent for rental units with different numbers of bedrooms, and they assign those to these families. And again, what the data provider is trying to do is show what it truly costs just to get by, not really to do well or live in luxury, but just to get by. And what that means is that they're not very generous with the size of a rental unit that they give to a family. So if it's a family of 4 with 2 small children, what the data provider may require is only a 2-bedroom house. If it's 3 kids and 2 of them are preschoolers and 1 is an infant, it's still only 2 bedrooms because they assume that the infant will be sleeping in the same bedroom as the parents. So that's how we get to these low numbers. They do reflect actual units that are on the market, but not always the largest unit that you would imagine a family of these sizes wanting. And the goal here is really just to get to something that we can all agree on is, kind of very, very basic, not to reflect kind of a more generous standard of living, which I think we all aspire to for all the people in our society. But we're just trying to show what it takes to get by. Any other reactions to this or questions? Okay, happy to come back to this again. What we do is we take these family budgets and we try to find families in actual federal survey data from the American Community Survey and understand what portion of families in that survey are not living at that standard. The standard set, depending on the size of the family, the workers, who's working and who isn't, and the ages of those children. And what we find is that 28% of the region's population live in families that we call struggling families or struggling working families. And these are families whose incomes do not meet that threshold set for their family size. But these are families that do have at least one worker in the household, somebody who is working and bringing earnings home, and yet still struggling to make ends meet for their family. We find that another 10 or 11% of the region's population belong to what we call struggling non-working families. These are families whose incomes don't cover their needs, and they also don't have a worker in the family. And what we know is that most of these struggling non-working families are actually headed by senior citizens who have aged out of the labor market. They've retired and are probably living on Social Security income that's just not quite enough for what they may need to get by. And that leaves the other 61 or 62% of folks who are making that money, making what they need to provide at least the bare minimum that their families need to survive. What we know is that this does vary across the region. So in Yuba and Sutter County, it's actually quite high. It's 36% of families are struggling to make ends meet, despite having at least one worker in the family. And in Placer and El Dorado counties, it's lower. It's closer to 20%. These reflect, different family compositions across these regions, different costs of living across these regions, and different labor markets. As well as kind of just other kind of commuting patterns. So, we know that a lot of affluent workers who may commute to Sacramento to work actually live in Placer and El Dorado counties and are doing just fine despite the high cost of housing there. So there's a lot of variation here, or a lot of explanations for the variation, but the variation is there nonetheless. Another concern is not just the number of people or the share of people that are living in these struggling families, but also the share of the next generation that is growing up in these struggling families. So we find that over half of the region's children belong to struggling families of one kind or another. 44% belong to struggling working families. So that's a concern that a majority of the region's kids are growing up in resource-constrained environments. There's plenty of recent social science research that suggests that these kids are going to face barriers as they grow up and begin to enter the labor market. They won't be as successful as their peers who grew up with everything that they need. And so making sure that we are expanding opportunity for more of these struggling workers is not just something that we need to do today to help them out. It's really about creating a stronger basis, a stronger future for the kids and for the regional economy as a whole. And what we do now is we look at who these workers are then. So if we really are focused on connecting these people to economic opportunity, we need to understand kind of why they're struggling to make ends meet and what their characteristics are and therefore how we may be able to help them. So one thing that we see is that younger workers and workers with less education have a harder time commanding those high wages that they need in order to support their families, or in some cases even support themselves. So for workers 18 to 24 years old who are just entering the labor force, they don't necessarily have the job experience necessary to command high wages, even if they only really need to support themselves. Whereas workers who are older and have, as much as 20 or 30 years of workforce experience, they have a considerably lower chance of struggling to make ends meet for their families. Same thing with education. Workers, who have a 4-year degree are substantially less likely to struggle to make ends meet compared to workers who have no degree. One thing that we know just from looking at the bachelor's degree holders who are struggling to make ends meet is that a lot of them are also in this group, the 18 to 24-year-olds. So we think that in the long run, they'll be fine. They'll be okay. What we really are focused on are these workers who have at least a high school diploma, or in some cases, some post-secondary education, and yet are still struggling to find a foothold in the economy that allows them to support their families. We also see really big disparities by race and ethnicity. So Hispanic workers are considerably more likely to struggle to make ends meet than their white counterparts, as are Black workers and workers who are Native American. We see fairly similar outcomes for men and women in terms of their likelihood of struggling to make ends meet, but we'll see some other disparities in a moment. And again, once we do share this out with you, you'll be able to explore these graphics at your own pace and look at what this looks like for each of the subregions. So, we can see here that, basically the same trends and kind of, what it breaks down to by age. Younger workers are more likely to struggle to make ends meet in every subregion. But you can see that the likelihood is very different. It varies from 48% of 18 to 24-year-olds struggling to make ends meet in Sacramento and Yolo counties versus just about 1/3 in Placer and El Dorado counties, or only 25% in Nevada County. And we have these graphics built for each of those demographic characteristics. And then here we can see that a huge portion of the people that we're talking about in these, a huge portion of these struggling workers are actually people who are over 24. These are people that are in the prime years of either starting a family in the case of 25 to 34-year-olds, or raising a family in the case of 35 to 54-year-olds. So really, really big population. This is 2/3 of the struggling worker population being in these two age groups. Likewise, these struggling workers, most of them have the education that they need in order to education that they need to compete for high-paying jobs. So 30% have a high school diploma, another 25% have some college or certificate degree, others have an associate's degree. Again, these bachelor's degree holders, we're not worried about them. We know that they're primarily younger workers who are going to be okay in the long run. And then, as we think about economic and workforce development, the implications of this analysis for those institutions and strategies, the first step for people without a high school diploma is to get that equivalency. So they're not going to be able to be served by an economic development strategy. We've got to find other kinds of educational interventions for them first. Also concerning is just how large of this population is as people of color. 60% of them, or a little bit more than 60%, are people of color, including 31% of whom are Hispanic. And then we see fairly equal breakdowns between men and women in terms of their status here. Back to that point about this being a multi-generational problem, we find that parents are actually quite likely to struggle to make ends meet. So 37% of struggling workers who are parents of children, minors, children that are under 18 or still in college, so dependent. So we see 37% of those parents are struggling to make ends meet, and this varies by what type of parental relationship they're in. So married parents are substantially less likely to struggle to make ends meet, although still more likely than the regional average for these workers. Single parents, though, are considerably more likely to struggle to make ends meet, particularly single mothers. And so this goes back to that multi-generational challenge. And here we can see that really a substantial portion of our struggling workers are parents about a quarter of them are married, and another 15%, 16% are single parents. This is another big group that we need to be thinking about, and so this makes childcare actually an important component of making sure that affordable childcare is an important component of making sure that people can access good jobs and make the best decisions for what they are able to earn. So finally, as we conclude this section, what we're really working towards here is an analysis of these workers so that we can understand what types of jobs would help them and what kinds of labor market experience and skill sets they have in order to compete for these good jobs. But we still have to articulate what kinds of good jobs that we're talking about. And to help inform that decision that we left up to the region, we created this chart, which shows how many struggling people or people in struggling families would be helped if the workers in their families made this wage. So what we find is that for those struggling parents, if we wanted to lift half of them into that non-struggling status where they are no longer struggling but have all of the income that they need in order to cover their family's basic expenses, the average struggling parent would need to make $63,444 a year. If instead we said, well, let's just forget about the parents, let's just focus on any kind of struggling adult, we come away with a lower threshold of around $47,000 a year. Or if instead we decided to be maybe very, very ambitious and say, well, it's not really about the parents, it's about the kids, that would mean in order to lift a majority of kids out of that struggling status, we would need an average wage for a struggling worker to be around $71,000 a year. Through a lot of consultation with leaders around the region and including in each of the subregions, what we set the goal for, we set the goal of a good job as is to lift half of struggling parents. So we are trying to get to this mark on the red line. Now, this does vary across the subregions. So in Sacramento and Yolo counties, it's pretty close to the region average. In order to lift half of struggling parents, we would need a wage of around $62,000 or $63,000 a year. Whereas in Colusa County, it's considerably less. It's closer to $59,000 a year. In Placer and El Dorado, it's actually, let's look at Nevada, where it's actually considerably more. In Nevada County, in order to lift half of those struggling parents, we would need an annual wage or annual earnings of around $68,000 a year. And then this green line shows how many jobs or how many workers actually have a good job at that wage. So this has ended up being how we defined good jobs for these struggling workers, what we're really striving for. A good job is a job that pays a living wage or a livable wage for workers in each of the subregions. So for Placer and El Dorado counties, that livable wage is $69,000 or close to $79,000 a year. In Nevada County, it's $68,000. In Sacramento and Yolo, it's $62,000 a year. Colusa, it's $60,000 a year. And then in Yuba and Sutter counties, it's $59,000, close to $60,000 per year. In addition to earning this wage, what we're saying is a good job also provides employer-sponsored health insurance, which we see as a proxy for other types of employment benefits like paid family leave and hopefully employer-sponsored retirement plans. So this is really kind of how we come up with our definition of a good job is, again, jobs that pay that livable wage, provide benefits, and are likely to continue to provide pathways to jobs that provide these types of things in the future. We're about to go and talk about these good jobs or these quality jobs in the capital region in a moment. What I want to tell you is that we're also in the process of trying to identify what we call promising jobs. And these are jobs that may not meet all of these criteria today. So they may not pay a livable wage or they may not provide benefits. But through our analysis, we believe that these are jobs that will provide career pathways to a good job within the next 10 years. So for that early career worker who's just entered the labor market and is really struggling to get by, what we're looking for are really good entry points for them. Where can we get somebody attached to the labor market in a job that leads to a better job in the future, or a good job that can support them and their growing families. Okay, before I jump into what those good jobs look like, I'm going to pause here and see if we have any questions or reactions to the struggling families analysis, these wages that I've just gone through, or these definitions. I see questions about when we'll make all of this available. Oh, and good, Evan shared that out. Yeah. We do want to make sure this is all locked down and airtight before the public starts sharing it and interacting with it. We wouldn't want to base any decisions off of things that haven't been fully fact checked yet. So we want to keep these close until then, but we do look forward to sharing in the future. Okay, I don't know if this is just stunned silence. Like I said, data by 1,000 cuts, maybe half of you are asleep, but I'll move on, but feel free to chime in the chat if you have any questions or reactions that we should discuss.
Just wanted to say this is really great information. I put it in the chat too, but thank you for sharing this out. This is really valuable. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Donna. Thanks for that. So this is the newest part of the deck. This has come together really just in the last 2 weeks. So forgive me for not having more kind of bullets and explanation to accompany this yet, but we're getting there. So now we've got that good jobs definition. Let's start then talking about, okay, so what are these good jobs and how many do we have? We assess that about 35% of the region's job base are what would qualify as good jobs. And that's according to those definitions for each of the subregions. And that's really good. That's a much higher share than we see in a lot of other high cost regions of California where some of those wage thresholds are higher, or job quality is lower, maybe due to, an agriculturally based economy. So this is really good. We do see some variation across the regions though. Of course, in Sacramento and Yolo, they're pretty close to the average, but in Nevada County, we see it's actually much lower, close to 1/5. And I've got another slide here where we can kind of see all of them at the same time here. So here's the region average. You can see Sacramento and Yolo County do better than average, but really all the other regions do slightly worse, with Nevada being kind of the outlier here. Remember that for some reason, we've got a very high threshold for Nevada County. Despite it not being a very expensive place to live, it has very large families. And that means that those parents actually need to earn fairly high earnings in order to support their families. And so you can see the variation throughout. What's interesting is that we see some of those same variations in outcomes that we saw by education, age, race, and gender, but with some different implications. So again, we see that age is a really important determinant of whether or not somebody holds one of these good jobs. So if you are, basically 35 to 64, you've got a pretty decent chance of holding a good job. By our definition. Whereas if you are 18 to 24, you have almost no chance of holding one of these good jobs. Again, that's why, we are trying to identify promising jobs, is so that we can identify not just, people who have good jobs today, but also how we get these younger workers or other workers who are entering the labor market attached to good pathways to good jobs in the future. We also see that there are, really big and maybe not surprising differences in the likelihood of holding a good job if you have a bachelor's degree versus no degree. So 60% of people with a 4-year degree have a good job, whereas just 1 in 8 or less, or a little more than 1 in 8 people who have no degree have a good job. And you can see other variation in here too. We also see really big disparities by race and ethnicity. Just about everybody is less likely to hold every group of workers is less likely on average to hold a good job compared to white counterparts. with it being especially low among Native Americans, which is, of course, a big concern. And then, we didn't see really big disparities in, likelihood of struggling to make ends meet, or the share of the struggling population when we were talking about gender before. But now we see all of a sudden there's this 9 percentage point gap between men and women in terms of the percentage of them who hold a good and promising job. And I think we'll see in a moment why this may be. It's probably going to be explained by the types of jobs that are good, and how those jobs tend to be more kind of blue collar jobs that have been dominated by men historically. And then, of course, we see a huge gap between the workers who are self-sufficient and those who are struggling to make ends meet. So just 5.2% of our struggling workers actually have a good job. And for context, that means that we've got 300,000 struggling workers in this region who are struggling to make ends meet, struggling to make ends meet and need a good job. It may be 400,000. It's 400,000. So that's about 1/4 of the job base that kind of we would need to either figure out how to grow or transition into a good job. So this is what I was talking about a moment ago, is which sectors concentrate these good jobs. So here we have the average for all industries. So 34.9% of all industries have are 35% of all jobs in the economy are good jobs. But we can see substantial variation across sectors and industries. So among tradable industries, about 42% of jobs are good jobs. Among those local serving industries that are fueling the region's growth, only 25% are good jobs. And then we can see the public sector, of course, a lot of these are good jobs. Utilities is always, a high performer on this good jobs metric. There's a lot of mechanical work, a lot of experience that goes into maintaining or building out utility systems, whether it's power, or water and sewer, or even trash. Headquarters jobs, all very good. Same thing for professional services, government administration, information, finance. One thing that all of these have in common is that they are dominated by people with 4-year degrees. That, at least in these kind of white collar industries, not necessarily utilities, but a lot of these have 4-year degree holders. And then we see wholesale, construction, education, manufacturing. And this is, by the way, all kinds of education, both public and private, higher ed, K through 12, all of it. And then we have logistics down here. So you can see there's quite a bit of variation across these sectors. And we see also differences across the subregions again. So the kind of biggest or most prevalent or most concentrated areas of job quality vary from one region to the next. You can see the order of these things shifting as I go through here. What's good in one region may not necessarily provide the same sorts of access to opportunity in another, which is another reason why we need to be thinking about sub-region variation. And then on this next slide, we have the ability to kind of explore what this looks like at a more detailed level of industry disaggregation by sector. So let's look at manufacturing. So here we can see that, of course, microelectronics, petroleum processing, chemicals, transportation equipment, this is where those zero emission vehicles are. All of these are actually better than average sources of job quality. Where we get into trouble is around textiles, food processing and food manufacturing, apparel. Those tend to not do as well on job quality. And then we can see here why we see so much variation in the share of jobs that are good across these sectors. So for what we should really kind of be trying to focus on as economic developers and workforce developers is where do people with different, levels of education, hopefully some sort of post-secondary level of education, where can they find the best opportunity to get a good job? So for people who have some college or a certificate, their best chances in utilities or mining, information, construction, government, professional services, headquarters. We can do the same thing, look at people with an associate's degree and see where their best shot is, or people with a bachelor's degree, where a lot of those white collar industries again show up: government, professional services, headquarters, finance. We can also explore this, but for along different metrics as well. Age, we've got race and ethnicity in here again. So see, Hispanic workers is a really big portion of our population, and their chances of getting a good job look, similar to what we're seeing overall. Really great chances in utilities, headquarters, professional services, government, information, and finance. And I believe, yeah, we have this for each of the subregions. So you could just, when this becomes available later, you can just click through and explore these data, see for your region where are good jobs concentrated. And then an important last note here on good jobs is that the industries or sectors that concentrate jobs or have where the largest share of jobs are good jobs are not always the industries that have the most good jobs. So remember, 80% of utilities jobs are good jobs, but utilities is one of the smallest sectors in this region, providing just 3,800 good jobs. So when we think about growing the economy, we're really not going to have much traction in utilities. Really, we'd be better served by trying to understand why utilities does such a good job of creating or providing good jobs, and try to replicate that in other sectors or other types of occupations. Government, meanwhile, good provider of concentrates good jobs in terms of the share of jobs that are good there, and also has a huge number of them. Healthcare doesn't really concentrate as many good jobs, but provides a lot of them. Same thing with education and professional services. So it's important for us to think not just about the concentration of job quality, but also the number of good jobs there, and therefore kind of what our opportunities are for growing off that base and closing that gap of 400,000 workers who need better opportunities here. And then we've broken this out again by demographic group and subregion. So you can explore here and see, what share of good jobs, or how many good jobs are held by different types of workers in each of these sectors. So in government, the most good jobs are held by people who are aged 35 to 54. We can look at this in terms of education and see that, in government, again, a really big reason why it concentrates so many good jobs is because it just concentrates people with 4-year degrees. Same thing with some of these other white collar sectors like professional services, where you can see it looks like maybe 70 to 80% of those good jobs are held by people with 4-year degree, and in healthcare. And again, we've got this for each of the subregions, so you can go and look at what this looks like across each of the subregions at your own pace. So this brings me to the close of that section, and we've got like 3 more slides to get through today as part of our kind of preview of these analysis. So I'll just pause here for a moment and try to catch up on the chat and any other questions people may have about how this is shaping up.
Yeah, there's a question here about did the good job sectors research take into consideration supply chain for each of these sectors?
No, we have not considered the supply chain for the sectors. What we're doing is we're using just the administrative data and then survey data that we have on who holds jobs in these sectors to determine what job quality looks like in each industry or each sector. What we will be doing later on is a clusters analysis, and this is something that's actually in the works right now. We hope to have it ready in the next couple of weeks. And that analysis of the region's kind of big cluster opportunities or industry cluster opportunities, that will look at supply chains. So how industries are trading with each other, as well as what job quality looks like within those industries, to understand what growth strategies may fall out of that sort of analysis.
So Chad, this is Pat Funkushita, and I'm sorry I'm not on video, but the reason why I asked the question, your utility number looked a little bit low, just in terms of the, the total amount, right, based for job. And I think that was just based strictly on non-supply chain, right, looking at just utility as a sector. And the reason why we talk about supply chain is one of the things that we're looking at right now from a policy perspective is really understanding where those opportunities lie for small businesses within that supply chain to start to get additional contract opportunities in order to be able to hire the kind of workers that need to be hired that might not go directly to a PG&E or might not go directly to a SMUD or might not go directly to a utility, but could go to a company that is doing a lot of contract work with those utilities, which could then increase the opportunity to create those kind of high-paying jobs. And so that's one of the reasons why I was asking the question around what this looks like. Because if you think about everybody who's on the call today, my company is one of them. We're small businesses. I'm a nonprofit small business. I employ 32 employees. I pay good wages, right? But I don't know if I'm in this study, right? You see what I'm saying? I get contracts with the city. I get contracts with the county. I get contracts with the state. I'm part of that supply chain that then provides really good paying jobs. I provide healthcare. I provide retirement, but I don't know if I'm counted here, right? So that's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying.
So just to that part of the question, anybody who has who employs workers and pays unemployment insurance for those workers, or reports income tax for those workers, those jobs are reflected here, and your business is reflected here. Okay. But I think you're drawing an implication here for public policy and for businesses that is really important.
And for future growth, right? Because right. 80 to 90% of our economy is run on small business, right? Whether that's tradable or not, right? There needs to be a strategy around how we better support that ecosystem in order to better connect it to those sectors that are growing.
Right. And I think, we've seen in other regions, the public policy trying to explore procurement as an avenue for raising job quality, government procurement or healthcare procurement, these humongous institutions that spend so much buying goods and services from other local businesses. They have a huge amount of leverage to help raise job quality, not only in their for the region overall, given that they are big job providers, but also because they're huge buyers of those services and goods. Yeah. They can help lift up job quality as an important metric for winning a contract.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Chad.
Nonprofits too, yes, sure. Any other questions or reactions to all of this? Okay. Well, we're starting to get into implications, and I mentioned before that we've got kind of 3 sections that we are building out around those assets that the region can build on in order to support higher quality job growth and job creation. One of those is clusters, which is still in the works. Another is research and innovation, which is actually half complete, but we probably won't have time to get into that today. And then the last piece is really around talent, where we have started building out some of the implications of this research on good jobs in terms of what it means for talent or job training. So for today, what I'm going to focus on are kind of what the talent requirements in these good jobs look like and how prepared struggling workers are for those good jobs. And then what we may need to do in order to help them be even better prepared for good jobs. This analysis is something that will change once we have our numbers on promising jobs in where we'll also be able to look at kind of what these metrics look like for workers who are just getting attached to strong pathways to good jobs. And also in the future, we'll be building out this talent section to look at other aspects as well, such as how well the junior college system or the two-year college system does at preparing workers for good jobs, and also what the specific talent demands look like in the region's priority clusters once we've been able to provide research to help us identify those. But for today, let's just talk about what those talent requirements look like in good jobs. So again, this is new, so we're just building this out. So forgive the lack of text here. We're still filling things in. But what we have here is the relative importance of different types of human capital to those good jobs compared to other jobs in the capital region. So other jobs is what we kind of euphemistically title jobs that are not good in the region. So these are jobs that don't, provide that annual wage or don't provide benefits. And so what we're doing is we're saying, okay, well, what's really important? What are the important human capital facets in good jobs compared to other jobs? And what we find is that a lot of technical knowledge and skills are actually a lot more important to our good jobs than they are in other types of jobs. So, for instance, we find that programming, the ability to code computer programs is about 1.7 times more important in good jobs than in other jobs. We also find that operations analysis is 1.7 times more important to good jobs than other types of jobs. Same thing for science, technology design, installation, engineering and technology, systems analysis, financial resources, systems evaluation, management of material resources, equipment selection. And then we have a few knowledge facets here, including computers and electronics. And then the list goes on. What I want to note is that this is an analysis of 120 specific human capital facets broken out across 3 domains: abilities, skills, and knowledge. So within each of those domains, we have about 60 facets. And here we're only showing the top 50 most important compared, again, to other jobs. And so what we're seeing here is a lot of those technical skills. We see a lot of knowledge categories and just a few abilities. And what's remarkable about those abilities is that they are primarily not physical abilities, like the ability to turn one's body or what one's kind of physical strength is, or what one's vision abilities are. Instead, these are cognitive abilities. So the fluency of the ideas, which is what I have pulled up right now, is the ability to come up with a number of ideas about a topic. The next one is mathematical reasoning, which is the ability to choose the right mathematical methods or formulas to solve a problem. That is something that's not innate, that is learned. And then down here, another ability that we have is originality, which is the ability to come up with unusual or clever ideas about a given topic or situation to develop creative ways to solve a problem. So again, we see a lot of kind of technical knowledge and skills and a lot of abilities and knowledge that deal with problem solving and creativity in the workplace. We have this broken out also by level of education. So for people who have an associate's degree and have a good job, we see that their skills, again, in some of those technical areas are really, really important. So installation is 3 times more important in a good job for a person with an associate's degree than for a person with an associate's degree who holds another type of job. Same thing with repairing, it's twice as important. Equipment selection is twice as important. Equipment maintenance is also twice as important. And then we get into programming, operations analysis, building and construction, engineering and technology. We also look at it for people with some college or certificate, where again, we see a lot of those same skills. Or we can look at it for people with a bachelor's degree and see again that even for workers with a bachelor's degree, it's the skills that are important more so often than knowledge. Although we see a few important knowledge categories here, like engineering and technology or building and construction. So all of this kind of points to the types of jobs that are good and the types of skills that a worker might need in order to compete for them. And again, we've done this for every sub-region as well. So it's not just a regional analysis. We provide what this looks like for the specific types of good jobs that are prevalent in each of the sub-regions. So Sacramento and Yolo, we've got Placer and El Dorado, Yuba and Sutter, Nevada, and Calusa. Next, what we want to understand is, okay, now we know what's really important for these good jobs. Are struggling workers actually suited to these types of jobs? You know, in terms of what they know how to do they have the skills that are most critical to getting a good job in whatever subregion they live or work in? And what our analysis shows is that actually they are. We find that our struggling workers overall have over 85% of the human capital that they need in order to compete for one of these good jobs. So that still leaves a small gap of about 15 percentage points of the human capital that's required, but that's still pretty close. We see that these workers do slightly worse in terms of their kind of human capital gaps in knowledge and skills, which we know from our previous slide are really important, but do much better on abilities. And then we see that actually once we start doing this, you know, for specific work for workers with specific levels of education, the gaps actually shrink. So when we look at workers with less than a high school diploma, their gap is actually just about 11 points. For people with a high school diploma, it's closer to 12 points. For people with some college or certificate, it's closer to 13 points, and then associate's degree, 14 points. For workers with a bachelor's degree, they have almost everything that they need in order to compete for a good job. They're just 7 points shy. So that tells us that they're actually probably a lot of these workers who are struggling and have a bachelor's degree, they're probably younger. They're going to be able to kind of close these gaps in the labor market. But again, with each of these others, you know, we can see that they're actually doing, you know, they're closer to what they need than the average worker. And again, this does vary across the regions. Some regions have worse job gaps or better job gaps than others. It's interesting that in Yuba and Sutter counties, bachelor's degree holders are actually considerably far away from the skills that they need in order to compete for a good job. Whereas in Sacramento and Yolo counties, they're actually quite close. So again, regional variation is really, really important. But overall, what we see is that these workers have, you know, quite a bit of what they need to compete for these good jobs. We just need to help them close that small gap between what they have and what the average worker in one of these jobs already knows. And that's where this analysis comes in handy. So here we're looking at the most critical skills gaps or human capital gaps related to these good jobs. So we're looking at the most critical gaps between struggling workers and good jobs. And these are ordered in terms of how important they are to good jobs. What we can see here is that the biggest and most important gap is around operations analysis, where on a 100-point scale, we need to move a worker up from a struggling worker up from a level 16 to a level 31. In terms of the skills, the science skill, which is using scientific rules and methods to solve problems, we need to move them up from a level 15 to a level 27. In computers and electronics, we need to move their knowledge base up from a level 38 to a level 53. And again, we've got this for each broken out for different levels of education and also each subregion. I'm not going to go through each subregion or all of the different levels of education today because that's just a little bit too in the weeds, but I wanted to show you kind of the level of detail and precision that we're trying to build into this data book and trying to make available to the subregions early in the new year, once all of this is settled and we can kind of extrapolate from some of this detail into some stylized facts and findings that can help inform the region's path forward in the Jobs First program. So I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to pull these slides back up if there are any questions or reactions, or we need to go back to anything that I've covered that was confusing, because I'm sure I've not done the best job in every case. So I'll stop now and open it up for questions, reactions to this specifically, or to the entire process that we're following here.
I think Annette has a question.
Go ahead, Annette.
Thank you so much. I'm just actually following up to Pat Funkashita's question, and it may be possible with the existing data set. I don't know, but what you just showed us that if a person moves this skill from here to here, they can have this much growth. We're actually looking for that same level of detail in the small business supply chain, because the small businesses, it's like, why are they growing? They're growing to provide a service or a product, whatever that is. You grow because you've got this new contract from a municipality and you need to hire staff. You need to hire high level staff for these jobs. So if we were, because small businesses make up 80 to 90% of our potential growth in the state, then if we were to make additional investments, right, in those small businesses, whether it's being able to support apprenticeships, procurement, you name it, across the board, then what would be that incremental improvement to the overall well-being of the citizens in our state or our region? We'll talk about the region, but right. So that's what she was trying to get at. How do we tell that story?
That's a fantastic idea. Maybe a potential application for some of this research.
Mm-hmm. But will the research be able to tell us that?
I think the use case is it sounds like it's so specific for each small business. I think it's interesting for a small business to think about, okay, who do I need to hire and what do they, how do I help them close a gap? But for building something that communicates to a small business, this is kind of what I need to compete for a contract. If I'm following that right?
It's the other side of it. So it's the workforce and economic policy implications for municipalities, right, that are contracting with these small businesses, but maybe it can be really challenging for the small businesses to contract with them. Some of the regulations that are involved are prohibitive. So if we were able to make it easier for small businesses to access resources, talent, what could that do to citizens in our region?
Yeah, I think that sounds really fascinating. It's probably a different kind of tool than what we're building out here.
Okay.
But I think that's a great idea to kind of maybe punt around with Valley Vision and maybe the Economic Development Agency at the city of Sacramento.
Okay.
So
thank you.
So I'll just jump into two things here. One is, if the question were, we have a lot of increased contracting in gray and green infrastructure, which is not actually an economic development intervention. It is a policy decision by government around spending more resources to achieve that kind of infrastructure transition or even electrification, right? It's going to create a number of higher quality jobs in trades, in other things, installations, and those are going to be certain skills in demand that will be required for, if you want to be a contractor, understanding the occupations and the ability, skills, and talents that are required across the different kinds of contracting activities. That's something that you could get from this data. We can aggregate up what are the kinds of skills and abilities or knowledge that is required in order to do the kind of work that's being created by those investments. I think, just to Chad's point, so that's one thing, right? The thing to Chad's point, and this may be something, again, that as we've been trying to grapple with the entrepreneurship, business dynamism for Main Street and traded sector, knowledge-based for smaller firms in the region, understanding them and where there are opportunities to expand on those. That is what you raised, is a level of analysis that we haven't been able to identify how to do it in this time frame that we've got. However, clearly that systems issue remains significant across the region. What's done locally versus what's done at a higher level to get economies of scale and maybe way more effective and efficient. And so I think that is the transition into what are we prioritizing and what kinds of tactics would be undertaken. There's obviously in all these categories additional information that's going to be required through that phase, and that may be something that it becomes a priority for figuring out as you determine what strategies and tactics you actually want to do in order to resolve the questions or the challenge that you're raising, and that we're seeing in some of the quantitative and qualitative feedback we've received. So 2 different answers for you, but maybe does that make sense?
It really does. Thank you. So it looks like we do need a part 2 to the data, and I can talk with Evan about
we
that.
may need a part 2. There's a lot of things that could require part 2. The question is which of those things is a priority for all the stakeholders in the region to choose. We think this is going to have high impact, and therefore we need to know something more about it before we choose what we're going to do about it or scale up about it.
Understood. Thank you so much. Thank you. This was fantastic. Like, I'm super excited about what the data can tell us, and it's a granular level of detail that we haven't had before. I think anecdotally we had some feelings about what the data was, but this gives us actual something tangible to hold on to that can help set our policy decisions going forward. So thank you.
Are there any other questions for Chad and the Brookings Cities GPS team?
Somebody wants to know how accurate the data is, Chad.
Well, all of the data are built on a mix of administrative data and survey data. And with survey data, we have sampling error, we have non-sampling error. So we know that, these aren't specifically what things are. We're of course taking what the calculations say, but there is a margin of error on some of these numbers. Because of the way these survey data work, it's really very challenging to calculate that margin of error. So it's not something that we're going to be able to pinpoint. What we are hoping to provide is something that is directionally correct. And I think that when you look across these data, you can get the sense that, okay, this does, for the most part, feel right. We know that a lot of these occupations or all of these industries that provide good jobs are blue collar jobs. We know that, these are 21st century jobs that do require some education and training. And these data do show that. And I think they just help us understand a little bit more specifically what those specific education and training requirements look like and what the good jobs look like. So we aren't trying to get to something that is 100% accurate. That's not possible, really. We are trying to get to something that can be a really useful and directionally correct basis for the region to start making some decisions about its direction.
I suspect that one of those points is back to the conversation about what housing costs, and that's been an issue raised everywhere. And that is in part a policy decision that reflects consistently, and Chad, correct me if I'm misstating this, but reflects consistently what living wage calculations, all the living wage calculators and built up a federal standard is. So they're, to grapple with those kinds of questions is different from the accuracy of some of making estimations based upon the inputs of the data.
Yeah, although the FMR data that I mentioned before earlier in this presentation, the fair market rents, that is actually very accurate. It's a very accurate portrayal of the housing market. I think where we get tripped up is just, what values are we attaching to that? What kinds of housing do we want for people? And what do we want people to be spending on housing as a percentage of their total budget? That's where things get thornier. And those are all fair critiques of those budgets.
I think the data itself is extremely accurate. The cutoff points of as a policy choice of the expectations are, as you said, is a different question from accuracy.
Well, in interest of time, we want to honor everyone who set aside a couple of hours to join us today. Are there any final questions for Chad or Rachel or Merrick?
It looks like there's a final comment here about the impact of the creative economy and whether that's shown in the data. I assume that's in the arts and recreation category, right, Chad?
Yeah, and I do think that this shows, you know, we don't, none of these necessarily shows the size or proportion or the size of the or role that these industries play in the economy. We're focused mostly on change and job quality. So it could just be that, you know, the quality of, or the size and contribution of the arts is hidden here. Also, you know, once we get into economic impact studies, that's counting jobs and economic activity that are actually already counted in our data, but just in other sectors. So I won't argue with the idea that the creative economy creates economic impact, but that economic impact is then measured in other industries. The creative economy itself is also quite diffuse. It's not just going to be in arts and recreation. It's also going to be in professional services. It's going to be in information, where we see a lot of creatives actually creating graphics and graphic design, or designing new systems. So the creative economy is really large and sprawling and kind of difficult to pin down. But I don't doubt your math. I just think it's probably maybe not articulated. The industry itself and its sprawling nature is not articulated well in the labels on these sectors.
Thank you. Well, a big thank you to Chad and Rachel and Merrick for bringing this information to us today. And it sounds like the full research product that folks can dig into and dive into the sub-regional data and comparisons will be available in Q1. I think exact date to be determined, so look forward to that. There's a link that was just recently dropped into the chat, and that is in case you are not currently connected to the sub-regional tables. We encourage you to be participating in the events in your region. So if you're not receiving that information, you can follow that link to get connected to receive that. And thank you to all of you for spending 2 hours this late afternoon with us to review the data, ask questions, which really helps us refine the efforts that we're doing here. If any further questions come up for you, you can feel free to email Evan, Maritessa, Darlena, or myself, and we'll get those questions elevated to the research team. So again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening.